These tutorials will show you how to make a complete mobile game with character unlocks, in-app purchases, video ads, and all that stuff. And check it out. This game is physics based, so you also learn how to do physics, coin pickups, high scores, all sorts of stuff. And you can play the game now if you search Downhole on Google Play or click the link in the description. Welcome back. Okay, so I don't know how your project is set up, but I'm gonna show you how I set up my projects. When you first begin Unity, you can choose kind of like a setup. And I would go with 2D or 2D mobile. Now, we are making a mobile game. However, I'll show you what you need to install, so you don't need to download the mobile version. Anyway, so for your project name, you're just gonna name it My Shitty Little Game. And then we're gonna proceed. All right, so in the previous video, I showed you how I got this awesome layout done, but basically all these windows, you can rearrange them. And then once you get them looking sleek like you can go over here to Window, Layouts, and then you can save your layout. These videos are part of a playlist, you should watch them all. I want to tell you though why this layout is optimal for creating mobile games. So here we have the hierarchy. The hierarchy is all the game objects we have in the game. So if I open this up, boom, look at that. We can see all the game objects we have in the game. And here, the cool thing about mobile and doing a vertical mobile game is that you could have both your scene and your game side by side. If you don't know the difference between these, the game, you can't click or control anything in here. This is showing you basically what the game would look like on the mobile device. The scene is where we get all the work done. You know, this is where all the work gets done. But since when you're working, you don't really need to see the game. So there's not really a reason to have both of these windows open at the same time. So if I drag this over here, it frees up some space. And even though I have the scene open here, once we hit the play button, it's going to automatically switch to the game window. So we don't really need to have the game window open. Something though that you need to know about the game window is you should set the resolution that you want to aim for. So since we're making a mobile game, I'm going to choose 18:9 portrait mode. So if I do free aspect, the resolution of my game is going to be basically the resolution of this window. And this is completely pointless and you're never going to use this. So the only reason you would use free aspect is to see how your UI is anchored. Look at those buttons on the bottom. You see how they're stretching? I'm gonna show you how to do that stuff. But basically, it doesn't matter what resolution a person has because I set up my UI where stuff is anchored in the correct positions, and that's pretty much the only use for the free aspect. And I'm going for the 18:9 portrait resolution. The reason I'm doing this resolution instead of the 16:9 portrait resolution is because the 16:9 portrait resolution basically makes the game look a little bit wider. I don't know if you can see that. And what I want to know is if everything will fit on the tighter devices, because I got plenty of room to go, you know, up and down, but I don't have plenty of room to go the other way. Now, if your window looks something like this, I see noobs complaining about this all the time. Your scale is off. So you can zoom in and zoom out in the game window, and this is completely pointless. And oftentimes people don't realize that when they hit the play mode button, their game is zoomed in. As you can see, my game in play mode is taking up the entire screen. By the way, up here there's a mute audio button. After you've been playtesting your game for hours, music's gonna get kind of annoying. So feel free to hit that mute audio button. But what decides whether or not your game is full screen or not is that button right next to it. So what I like to do is use the play focused. And as you notice, I switched it and nothing happened. A quick little trick is that you can pause and unpause the game, and now it'll go to that setting. See, the game is still running. The reason why it's better to have the game not running in full screen mode is because if you have the game running while it's in focus mode, then you can look at your console, and your console is basically going to give you information about your game. Like if there's a bug or some kind of error. So if I have the scene window open and I hit the play button, the only thing that's really gonna change for me is that now it's playing the game window. And I can still switch back to the scene and work on the scene, and I can even put them side by side. However, you have to be careful putting them side by side because some code will run if things are visible. And if they're visible in the scene window, it's actually gonna run the code for them. So I don't like to run these two side by side. I like to instead just have the game window open or the scene window and switch in between them even while the game is running. And when you're in the scene window, you can't really play your game. It's like the buttons don't interact. What you're actually doing is you're clicking those objects. For example, in the game, if I swipe, it moves the character. And in the scene window, I can drag my character around. And you see, the physics aren't affecting it now. I'm overriding stuff. You can see that the camera is following it around. It's pretty awesome to see things happening in the scene view. And now if I let go of my character will fall back down. And there's two ways that you can select stuff in the scene. So one is you can just click on it. You can click on stuff, but sometimes things are layered, so it might be hard to get to what object you want. So the other way to click on stuff is using the hierarchy. And here, for example, I can click the player, and now I have the player selected, or you can search player, and then it'll filter out all the game objects that have that name. So make sure you name your stuff very well, because you're probably gonna try searching for it if you have a game that has a ton of stuff. I like to keep a lot of these objects minimized. Don't just leave everything open like this, because it's gonna get messy and hard to find stuff. When you click on an object, if you can't see it in the scene, for example, you're looking at like that, you can press F, but your mouse has to be in the scene window. You can press F and it'll zoom in to that object. And then you can use the mouse scroll wheel to zoom in and zoom out. Also, if you click your scroll wheel, you can drag around. Also, if you right click, you can drag around. If your game looks something like this, you got your scene in 3D mode. There's a 2D button at the top and it'll switch your game right back to 2D. When you pick an object from the hierarchy or click on it, you'll have this menu up here, and this menu will show you how you can move, you can rotate, you can scale an object, but really you should have your left hand on Q, W, E, R, just like League of Legends. And Q is the hand tool, and this lets you basically move around the camera, and then W is going to let you move around the object. And now, as you can see, there's a green arrow. Let me zoom out. There's a green arrow, and this only moves it on one axis. A red arrow that moves it on another. And if I switch back to that 3D mode, what you'll be able to see is that there's actually a third axis, which is this blue one, and that lets you move an object forward and back. But you want to avoid doing that when you're in 2D mode. Another way to move those objects around is the transform. The transform is basically your X, Y, Z position. So here I can put in a value and it'll move to that value, but also you can drag to change that value. And if you're in 2D mode, all of your objects should be at 0. We're not gonna use the Z index to put objects in front and behind each other. You might have been thinking that. That is not how we're going to do it. How you put objects in front and behind each other is in the sprite renderer. This is where we have the graphic for the character. As you can see, when I turn that off and on, these little checkboxes turn stuff off and on. And if you look in the hierarchy, you see the player, it's not grayed out, or the sprite, whatever, it's not grayed out. If I turn it off, now you can see it's kind of dim. So anything that's dim is turned off. So if I go back here and I turn the sprite back on, now that object is on, that object has a sprite on it, and the sprite has a sorting layer. This is how you move things forward and back. And we'll get into that in another video. But for now, just know that you should not be messing with the Z index, and the Z index should always be 0. However, when you create a new game object, let's say I'm gonna create a 2D game object here, and I'm gonna call it a sprite, and I'm gonna make it a square. So we created a square game object here. Sometimes the Z index might not be 0, so just go ahead and set that back to 0. I have free art assets you can use in your games. Just follow me on itch so you know when I update the pack. And here on the sprite renderer, you might notice that you don't see the sorting layer or something. Just remember, like, Unity has all these all these things minimized, and you need to open them up and there'll be more options there for you. So here we can see it's on the default layer. So just real quick to show you, I'm gonna make this square red, and I'm going to press W. And now instead of using these arrows to drag an object around, if you click this little blue box, it's so tiny, but I hope you see what I'm saying. If you click that blue box, you can freely drag the object around. So look, the object is behind my player. And if I click on the sprite on my player, you can see it's on the entities layer and the order is 10. So if I click back on this square and I put it on the entities layer, you can see the sorting layer is 0. And as I drag, once it's higher than 10, it went on top of the player. So the higher the number, the closer to the camera, or the more priority the object has when it's being rendered. So if I wanted this object to be behind the player, all I would need to do is set it to 9. If I wanted to be in front of the player, I would set it to 11. And you can have a character that has different body parts, and you can put the different body parts, like for example, let's say this character was wearing pants, and what I can do is I can take this and put it and drag it into the player object. You have to think of these objects as folders. So now that I have the player, I can drag the player around, and the player drags the, I have these particles getting created, ignore that. But basically now anything under this game object, when you see this arrow, anything underneath that gets moved around and gets affected by its parents, by the folder that's on top of it. Well, you can think of these as folders. I like to think of them as folders since we all know how folders work. Now this sprite, I'm gonna set it back to 0 and 0 because you wanna have the same pivot point. Here's what I mean. If we look at this character, here is the pivot point, wherever you see these arrows. And what I can do is I can take the sprite and I can drag it over here. But I didn't drag the player object, I just dragged the player sprite. And now if I click on player, you can see the pivot point is still here. So when I click on the sprite, now the sprite is selected, and noobs make this mistake all the time where they click on an object and they don't realize that they're not clicking on the topmost object, the parent, the folder that contains all of that stuff. So when you're moving an object around, make sure you're not moving an object that is, you know what I mean? Don't move the sprite around, don't move the pieces around, move the parent around. Because when we program this object to move, we're not gonna be moving the sprite, we're gonna be moving the entire parent object. And as you can see, I have particle effects here that follow the character, and they're in the wrong spot now because it's expecting the sprite to be in the center. So make sure that you put all your objects on the same pivot point. Find the topmost object, look at where that pivot point is, and now when I drag this character around, you can see the particle effects look like they're coming from that character. Okay, so let's finish going through the shortcuts. So E lets you rotate, and as you can see, there's 3 different colors here, and it doesn't really look right in 2D mode, but if I go to 3D mode, you'll see that it's a circle. And what this lets you do is rotate it on the different axis. So I can rotate it on this axis, and look in the game view. You can see it looks like it's squishing, but it's not squishing, it's tilting back and forth. And then the same thing with the Y axis. But really, when you're working in 2D mode, the main one you're gonna use is this blue one, which is the Z axis. And if we look up here, we can see the Z changing. And when we move the Z around, remember you can drag up and down, just whatever. You can drag up and down or left and right, and it'll change the number there for the Z axis. This is how you rotate your characters when you are in 2D mode. And lastly, R is to scale the character. You can barely see this, so I'm gonna darken my sprite here. There, now you can actually see those things. So here we have W, here we have E, and here we have R. And with R, if you drag one of these, it scales it that direction. And if you drag the middle one, it scales all directions. And you can see these numbers going up and down in the transform. Now for 2D mode, we actually don't need to scale it in the Z axis. And if I show you that I'm scaling it in the Z axis, it makes no difference. Only the Y and the X axis matter for 2D mode. Being able to tint your sprite color is pretty awesome, and you can do that through code. It's how I do a lot of particle effects, or how I create variations for objects. I'll show you guys how to do that in a future video. Okay, so let's go back a little bit to the more boring stuff. In your project window, you should only really have two folders: packages and assets. Packages is stuff that you're going to download, like extra tools and stuff like that. For the most part, always keep that closed. And assets is gonna be all the stuff that you have in your game, like the objects, the scripts, the music, etc. And you should make folders for that stuff. So make a folder for sprites, for sounds, for scripts, for scenes, for resources, for prefabs. So once you make your sprites folder, it's pretty easy to add art in. All you have to do is drag a piece of art into that folder. And now you can do it by opening up a folder in your Explorer, but your Unity folders are on your computer, so also you can add art just by having two folders open. Watch this. Open a new window, and now I can go ahead and find images on my computer and just drag them into the sprites folder. So you can access your assets by messing around in your folders or in Unity, whatever is easier for you. But if you're trying to put a lot of art into your game quickly, you might as well just open up the folder and drag in the art there. An easy way to get to the folder is to right click and hit Show in Explorer, and now it'll open the exact folder that you want, so that way you can get to it very quickly. And then another thing that you can do is, let's say you click on your project folder, and this is my project folder, or here's my project folder. You can right click and you can pin this to quick access, which will pin it here, and then you can get to certain folders a lot quicker, so you don't have to keep digging through folders. Okay, so something that you'll want to do right away is also make a scenes folder, right click, create, and then you're gonna do new scene. And I know there's a lot of options here, and man, sometimes it's really hard to find stuff. Where is scene? There we go, scene. So I created a new scene, and I'm just gonna name this like whatever, delete. I like to name stuff delete. so that way I remember to delete it later. So I'm gonna open up delete, and whoa, all of a sudden everything changed. Everything's messed up. There's nothing here, and it's perfect. So when you go to your sprites, to create a game object of one of your sprites, all you gotta do is you take, I'm gonna take this one, the frog. You can take the frog and you can drag it, and Unity is clever enough with certain objects, with certain assets, to know what to do with them. So I dragged this frog, and now we have the frog in the scene. And if you look at the frog, it gave it a transform and a sprite render, but it has nothing else. But the awesome thing about, and it named it what the asset was called. So we have this frog here, but oftentimes what people see in Unity is this like really ugly, blurry pixel art. And all you need to do is go to the asset and change the filter mode from bilinear to point. And this is really, really important. If you're doing pixel art, and honestly for almost any game, if you want the pixels to be visible and not blurry, you have to change the filter mode to point. Bilinear will make your pixel art look blurry. It's not doing it for me, which is a terrible example, and I think it's because I have the compression as none. But watch, if I do low quality and I hit apply, look how ugly it looks. And there's so many people who like throw in an art asset into Unity, then they see this in their game and they're like, Unity sucks, because Game Maker and other engines don't make it look that bad. So what you need to do is just switch your filter mode to point, hit the apply button, and now your pixel art is gonna look gorgeous. But I also don't like to compress my art, because pixel art doesn't need to get compressed. It's tiny file sizes. So you can just go ahead and do none for the compression. Some of the other important settings are that your texture should be sprite 2D, and the sprite mode should be single. Multiple is if you have several animations and you're going to cut them up. I'll show you how to do that in another video. And then for pixels per unit, the reason I did 16 is because these are assets. If I come down here and I drag this up, a lot of people miss this in Unity too. So if I drag this up, you can see my sprite is there and it gives me information about it. It gives me the file size. It's 1 kilobyte. I told you pixel art is tiny. It also shows me that the sprite is 16 by 16. So because a lot of my tiles in this game are 16 by 16, I set the pixels per unit to 16. But the pixels per unit is not that important. But what's important about this is that they all match. So for example, I'm gonna take this cat and I'm gonna drag it out here, and I created a cat game object. And now if I go into the sprite for this cat and I change this to 32 and I hit apply, guess what would happen? It shrunk. I thought it was gonna get bigger, but it shrunk. So you have to make sure that your pixels per unit is the same for every single game object. So I'm gonna set that back to 16. And honestly, in a future game, I'm probably gonna have this set to 1 just for simplicity's sake. By the way, if you have a little asterisk in your scene, it means it hasn't been saved. So just press that Control S. So now if I switch between scenes, you can see it loads everything in that scene. And you can think of scenes also as folders with a bunch of game objects. But scenes are the things that run. In Game Maker, they were called rooms. You could think of it as a room or a level. By the way, you can submit a sprite for me to put into the game. Just join the Discord. There's a link in the description. I think I'm getting carried away with these basic tips and it's starting to go all over the place and it's gonna turn into like an hour-long video. So please download Downhole. Let me know what you think. Give me some feedback. And future videos are gonna be a lot more focused. I'll see you guys next week. A Dev Life. It's kind of like a puzzle game because you got to decide, you know, how you traverse the area. I mean, you can go fast, but you can also take your time to kind of think about how you're going to execute the sections. Oh, check this out. Pro tip, you can use the stalactites to kill the enemies. Check this out. Oh, I thought I was going to get a double kill. Let's race the snail. Ooh.